Most Americans agree with this sentiment that there is an inherent value in work.
Said that Medicare is not as good as a lot of the private health plans that exist in the United States.
And then you hope that the next generation pays benefits into the system for your retirement, very much like a pyramid scheme.
The Cato Institute helped convince SCOTUS to rule against these organizations in 2018's Janus v. AFSCME. Evan.
What are unions?
Yes.
Nobody's going to accuse him of evolving or moving to the left or being some sort of squishy moderate like Kennedy kind of, or being more libertarian or something like that. Instead, he's an institutionalist. That is, he's looking at the court as a whole and the public perception of the court. He doesn't want the court to be seen as partisan. Can obstruction of justice be its own crime? Absolutely. Martha Stewart, lots of people get convicted of lying to the FBI without a conviction beyond that, for example, for insider trading or whatever else.
He said in January that my threshold for declaring a national emergency will be if I can't make a deal with people that are unreasonable. He said when he was actually getting ready to sign the paperwork on the emergency proclamation, I didn't need to do this. I'd just rather do it much faster.
Dan Ikinson, he's the Director of Trade Policy Studies from the Cato Institute. He says of these sales, when we talk about U.S.-China trade, it's a missing number. Lots of U.S. companies set up shop in China to be closer to customers and markets.
There was a narrative that took hold in Washington that China doesn't abide by decisions that come down from the WTO, and that's really not true. We would have had a lot more leverage had we gone that way. We should not have bailed out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which also gave us some leverage and some soft power.
The fact of the matter is, despite what's going on in the world today, the world economy is much, much more open than it was 50 years ago, even 30 years ago. It's much more open. And so that's why it's very worrisome to see that some of these norms and rules are being eroded, because it doesn't take much for that to deteriorate rapidly.
What I see in terms of the provisions that are being put forward are not this revitalization and revisioning of NAFTA to make it really better, but really to kind of scale it back and take a lot of the free trade out of NAFTA. And that is inherently problematic.
We have many of our major cities are on these coasts, such as New York, Miami, San Francisco, etc. We have non-contiguous states and territories, such as Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, and yet, despite all these advantages and having the biggest economy in the world, there are a total of 99 ships that are qualified to transport goods between 2 points within the United States. More than half of those ships are oil tankers. So we have just 40 some odd ships that can actually transport goods, containers between 2 U.S. points, and I think that's a real indictment of the Jones Act.
Christopher Preble is Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute and author of Peace, War, and Liberty, Understanding U.S. Foreign Policy.
The civilian leadership within the Trump administration should convey very clearly to the president that when he acts in ways that seem to be serving his personal interest and not the national interest, it will erode trust in the institutions of government, including the military itself.
I don't necessarily think that this administration actually wants a conflict with Iran. This is sort of another sign that they are saber-rattling, that they're trying to get a reaction out of the Iranians.
The Turkish writer Mustafa Akyol has likened the camps to the Soviet Gulag and called the new official attitude Islamophobia as state policy.
But in the U.S., there are institutions, there are certain checks and balances. When President Trump passes a Muslim ban, a judge can stop that. In Turkey, that judge would be in trouble himself.
Well, Bernie Sanders often says that if a company can't afford to pay a living wage, then perhaps, it shouldn't exist. And, there's a political choice here. You can go down the French model of the labour market, where you say, actually, companies that don't pay a certain amount just shouldn't exist, and those jobs shouldn't exist. But the consequence of that is a 9% unemployment rate rather than the sub 4% unemployment rate that we currently enjoy in this booming economy today.
But we shouldn't take stock markets as a barometer of the economy. As you say, the other measures that we have, which are most significant for people, because people's biggest source of income is their work, it's usually not their investments, then things are still looking quite bright.
I think this wealth tax, the pied-à-terre tax in particular, is incredibly misguided.
Look, if Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders want America to be more like Sweden, well, then they would have to reform Social Security, introduce school vouchers, abolish taxes on things like inheritance and property, because Sweden has liberalized dramatically in the last few years.
Now, I want to preface what I'm about to say next with this fact from a 2018 study by the libertarian Cato Institute that undocumented immigrants actually are less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans.
ICE is dangerously inaccurate. The Cato Institute came out with a report about a year ago that showed that from 2006 to 2017, 3,500 people were wrongfully detained by ICE.
The Medicare program is not a very good health insurance program, and you don't have to take my word for that. There's a member of Congress who used to run the Medicaid program. Her name is Donna Shalala. She was the Secretary of Health and Human Services under President Bill Clinton. She's a Democrat. And she said that Medicare is not as good as a lot of the private health plans that exist in the United States.
Michael Tanner literally wrote the book on entitlements and says when it comes to Social Security, the country changed, not the program.
When you pay your Social Security taxes, that money is not put away for your retirement. It is simply transferred to people who are already retired today. And then you hope that the next generation pays benefits into the system for your retirement. Very much like a pyramid scheme, if you will.
You know, in Ohio, they actually have a prison training program to teach people in prison to become barbers. But it's illegal to get a barber's license if you have a felony conviction in the state of Ohio.
80% of Americans agree that hard work is its own reward, and this is something that's widely shared. 85% of current welfare recipients, those individuals receiving means-tested government assistance, agree, including 69% of liberals and 84% of conservatives. So when it comes to an endorsement of the ideal of work, there actually isn't that much disagreement about that.
I think one of the most important things to realize is that occupational licensing is basically useless. It really doesn't protect us. I'm a lawyer, and if you think that occupational licensing keeps incompetent lawyers out of the field, I'm here to tell you that you're wrong.
I would support a decriminalization structure, but the problem is that usually means fines. Instead, it's going to be, instead of going to jail, you get a fine or a ticket or something like that. But the problem, again, if you're still enforcing that in the poor black and brown communities, you can't afford the fine. Then those add up over time. You lose your license to suspension. The cop's going to pull you over, get you for a suspended license, and boom, you're back in jail.
This is becoming a litmus test in the Democratic primaries as all of these different candidates are competing to be perceived as the most progressive candidate. I think this is going to be an issue for the Democrats, and they're going to hope to try to use this against Trump in the general, but I don't think it's going to work very well.
The risk for President Trump is that the Democrats will nominate a candidate with broad appeal. The risk for the Democrats is that they won't.
Isaiah Miller. I hope you're ready for this.
I have never been more ready to do anything in my life, ma'am. It is so nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. You come highly recommended by my friends at the Cato Institute. They wouldn't stop singing your praises.